Most people grow up with a quiet suspicion that something about them is wrong. They notice it early, in the way they think longer than others, in the way silence feels heavier to them than noise, in the way their mind refuses to slow down just because the world tells it to. At first, they try to ignore it. They learn to laugh when others laugh. They learn to speak when it's expected. They learn to shrink their thoughts into smaller, safer shapes. Because being different is exhausting in a world that rewards sameness, but the discomfort never fully disappears. It just goes underground, and eventually a question begins to surface, quietly, persistently. What if the problem was never me? What if the traits you've spent years trying to suppress were never flaws at all? What if they were signs, not of weakness, but of a mind that doesn't operate on the default setting? Not smarter in the way tests measure, not superior, just different. There's a certain kind of mind that doesn't move in straight lines. It branches, loops back, connects ideas that were never meant to touch. And when you live inside that kind of mind, life feels slightly misaligned. You talk to yourself sometimes, not because you're unstable, but because thoughts move faster than emotions can process them. Speaking becomes a way to slow the mind down just enough to examine it, to give shape to chaos, to test ideas before releasing them into the world. You aren't rehearsing conversations because you're insecure. You're simulating reality because your brain is always running scenarios. Others think in conclusions, you think in processes, so your thoughts spill outward. Not because you lack control, but because control requires structure, and structure requires language. And when language stays trapped inside, it collapses under its own weight. Your mind also drifts. Even when you're trying to focus, teachers called it daydreaming, bosses call it distraction, friends think you're not paying attention. But what they don't see is that the surface task finishes quickly for you. Once it does, your attention doesn't shut off, it turns inward. This is where connections form. This is where ideas collide. This is where meaning is extracted from seemingly unrelated thoughts. Your mind wanders because it has excess capacity, because it refuses to stay idle. Boredom isn't a lack of discipline for you, it's a lack of complexity. Your brain doesn't crave stimulation, it craves depth. That's why your environment often looks chaotic to others. Your desk isn't organized by appearance, it's organized by relevance. Objects aren't placed neatly, they're placed meaningfully. Highly abstract thinkers don't arrange space for aesthetics. They arrange it for mental accessibility. Order feels artificial when it's imposed from the outside. Chaos feels honest because it mirrors the internal process. You weren't lazy. You were allocating energy where it mattered. And then there's the night. The world slows down. The noise fades. Expectations go quiet. And suddenly, your mind feels awake for the first time all day. This isn't rebellion against routine. It's alignment. Some minds require silence to function properly. They need space without interruption, time without performance. When others sleep, you finally breathe. Not because you're avoiding life, but because that's when life stops demanding that you be someone else. You've always questioned things too. Rules, beliefs, social rituals that everyone else seems to accept without thought. You ask why, not to argue, but to understand structure. And eventually, people stop answering. They tell you you're overthinking. They tell you not everything needs depth. They tell you to relax. But your mind can't rest inside borrowed beliefs. It needs to test ideas personally, to see if they collapse under pressure, to know whether something is true or just repeated often enough to feel true. Your curiosity isn't defiance, it's survival, because accepting shallow explanations feels like self-betrayal. And slowly, you begin to realize something unsettling. You don't struggle because you're incapable. You struggle because your mind isn't designed for shallow systems. You process faster, you process deeper, you process differently, and in a world optimized for speed, noise, and conformity, that feels like isolation. But isolation isn't proof that something is wrong with you. Sometimes it's proof that you're standing at a different depth than the people around you. This is only the beginning, because the same traits that make you feel out of place are the traits that shape perception, creativity, and quiet power. In the next session, we'll explore why minds like yours often feel lonely, even in rooms full of people, and why that loneliness isn't a weakness, it's a consequence of seeing too clearly. There's a moment that comes quietly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel dramatic. It's the moment you realize that being surrounded by people doesn't guarantee feeling understood. You can be in a room full of voices, laughter, movement, and still feel completely alone. Not lonely in the emotional sense, lonely in the perceptual sense, because you're not just listening to what people say, you're listening to what they avoid, what they repeat, what they never question. And that gap between what's spoken and what's actually happening becomes impossible for you to ignore. You notice patterns others miss. You sense contradictions before they're visible. You feel emotional undercurrents before anyone admits they exist. And slowly, conversations begin to feel shallow. Not because people are shallow, but because most interactions are designed to protect comfort, not truth. Small talk feels exhausting. Not because you lack social skill, but because it requires pretending you don't see what you see. So you start withdrawing, not dramatically, not angrily, quietly. You speak less, you observe more. You choose silence over explaining thoughts that would only confuse or threaten others. This is where the misunderstanding begins. People assume you're distant, cold, detached, but the truth is almost the opposite. You feel too much context at once. Your mind doesn't experience conversations as isolated moments. It experiences them as systems. You're tracking tone, pauses, inconsistencies, motivations, emotional residue. While others are responding, you're processing. And by the time you're ready to speak, the moment has already passed. So you remain quiet, not because you have nothing to say, but because saying everything would take too long. This is why surface-level socializing drains you. It requires compression. It forces a complex internal world into simplified expressions that never quite fit. And each time you do it, something inside you feels slightly diminished, so you begin to prefer solitude. Not isolation, solitude. Solitude is where your mind regains its natural rhythm, where thoughts can stretch out instead of folding in on themselves, where ideas don't need to be justified, where curiosity isn't treated as disruption. Solitude is not avoidance, it's recovery. And yet, even in solitude, something unsettles you. Your mind doesn't rest. It analyzes past conversations, replays moments, dissects decisions. You overthink, not because you enjoy it, but because your brain is designed to explore consequences. While others are satisfied with good enough, your mind keeps searching for what else. This makes even simple choices feel heavy. You don't choose a restaurant. You choose a future emotional state. You don't send a message. You anticipate interpretations. You don't respond impulsively. You calculate impact. To the outside world, this looks like indecision. To you, it feels like responsibility. You understand that every choice creates a ripple, and once you see that, it becomes impossible to unsee. Your mind refuses shortcuts. it doesn't mean you're always right. It means you're thorough. And thoroughness is often mistaken for weakness in a culture that rewards speed. This is also why humor feels different to you. You don't laugh at obvious jokes. You gravitate toward irony, contradiction, dark humor, because humor, at its core, is pattern recognition. It's the ability to hold two conflicting meanings at once, and when your mind is comfortable with paradox, humor becomes layered. Others may miss it. Some may feel uncomfortable with it. But for you, it's a release. A moment where complexity finally gets to exist without explanation. The same applies to art. You're drawn to abstraction, to symbolism, to music without words. Not because you're trying to be different, but because your mind enjoys decoding. Straightforward stimuli feel empty. Complex stimuli feel alive. Your brain doesn't want answers handed to it. It wants something to wrestle with. This is why repetitive tasks exhaust you. You can solve intricate problems for hours, yet struggle to complete simple routines. Not because you lack discipline, because your mind shuts down when it's understimulated. You don't waste energy on what doesn't challenge you. Your brain is selective, not lazy. And slowly, this selective nature creates distance from people, from systems, from expectations you were never designed to meet. You start to feel like an observer of life rather than a participant, like you're standing slightly outside the current, watching everyone else move with ease. This is where doubt creeps in. Why does this feel harder for me? Why don't I fit? Why does everything feel so heavy? But heaviness isn't always a burden. Sometimes it's density. You're not carrying more weight, you're carrying more meaning, and meaning changes everything. It slows you down, it isolates you, it demands honesty. You can't unsee patterns, you can't unknow complexity, you can't return to shallow certainty once depth becomes visible. This is the quiet cost of perception, but it's also the source of something powerful, because the same awareness that isolates you also gives you clarity. You see through manipulation faster, you sense false narratives early, you recognize when something doesn't align, even if you can't yet explain why. You're not confused, you're discerning, and discernment often feels like loneliness in a world built on consensus. But this isn't the end of the story, because once you understand how your mind works, truly works, the loneliness begins to change shape. In the next session, we'll explore what happens when you stop fighting your nature and start using it, how clarity turns into quiet confidence, how depth becomes strength, and how the misunderstood mind learns to move through the world without shrinking itself. At some point, something inside you begins to change, not suddenly, not dramatically, quietly. It happens the moment you stop trying to correct yourself, the moment you realize that forcing your mind to behave like everyone else's has only made you smaller, not safer. You've spent years adapting, lowering the volume of your thoughts, softening your questions, hiding your intensity behind politeness. You learned when to stay silent, when to nod, when to pretend you didn't notice what you clearly noticed. And for a long time, that strategy worked. You blended in, you survived, you avoided conflict, but something was always missing. A subtle sense of dishonesty, because deep down, you knew you were performing a version of yourself that wasn't real. The shift begins when you stop asking, "How do I fit?" and start asking, "How do I function best?" This is where clarity replaces confusion. You begin to see that your mind was never meant to be tamed, only directed. Your overthinking isn't a flaw. It's raw analytical power without a framework. Once you give it purpose, it becomes precision. Instead of replaying conversations endlessly, you start observing patterns deliberately. Instead of questioning everything emotionally, you question strategically. Instead of drowning in possibilities, you sort them. You stop trying to think less, you learn how to think cleaner, and that changes how you move through the world. You speak less, but with more weight. You listen more, but with intention. You stop explaining yourself to people who aren't equipped to understand you. Not out of arrogance, out of clarity. You realize that not everyone deserves access to your inner world. Depth is not meant for mass consumption. It's meant for alignment. This is where confidence begins to emerge. Not loud confidence, not performative confidence, but quiet certainty. You stop reacting to noise. You stop defending your nature. You stop needing validation from people who operate at a different depth. Your solitude changes too. It no longer feels like escape. It feels like grounding. Time alone becomes a place where ideas sharpen instead of spiral, where thoughts settle instead of collide, where awareness becomes calm rather than overwhelming. You no longer fear your own mind, you trust it, and trust is transformative. Because when you trust your mind, you stop rushing decisions, you stop chasing approval, you stop forcing connections that drain you, you begin to choose carefully, people, work, environments. You notice that when something feels wrong, it usually is, and instead of doubting that feeling, you respect it. Your sensitivity, the thing you were once told was weakness, becomes guidance. You sense misalignment early. You recognize false depth instantly. You see when something is built on appearance rather than substance. This doesn't make life easier, but it makes it cleaner. You waste less time, less energy, less self-betrayal. You also begin to understand something important about others. Most people aren't shallow by choice. They're shallow by necessity. Depth requires responsibility. It requires facing contradictions. It requires sitting with uncertainty. Not everyone wants that, and that's okay. You stop resenting people for staying on the surface. You simply stop trying to pull them deeper. This is maturity. You let people be who they are, without shrinking who you are, and something unexpected happens. Your presence changes. You don't dominate rooms. You don't compete for attention. But when you speak, people listen. Because your words come from observation, not impulse. From clarity, not reaction. You're not louder, you're clearer, and clarity is magnetic. Not to everyone, but to the right ones. You begin attracting fewer connections, but stronger ones. Fewer conversations, but deeper ones. You no longer feel the need to be understood by everyone. Being understood by one aligned mind becomes enough. This is where the misunderstood mind turns into the self-directed mind. You stop asking the world for permission to exist as you are. You build your life around how your mind actually works, not how it's expected to work. You create space. You design routines that respect depth. You choose silence when noise is unnecessary. And in doing so, you stop fighting reality. You stop fighting yourself. You realize that your mind was never the problem. It was simply ahead of environments that couldn't hold it. This awareness doesn't make you superior. It makes you responsible. Responsible for where you place your attention. Responsible for how you use your insight. Responsible for not turning depth into isolation or bitterness. Because the same mind that sees clearly can also harden if it isn't guided. And that's the final challenge. Not understanding yourself, but choosing what you become with that understanding. That's what we'll confront next. Eventually, everything slows down. Not the world, your relationship to it. You stop feeling like you're being pulled in 10 directions at once. You stop reacting to every signal, every opinion, every expectation, because you finally understand something most people never stop to question. Your mind is not meant to fit into the world as it is. It's meant to see through it. For most of your life, you tried to live as if clarity was a burden, as if depth was something to manage, as if sensitivity needed to be hidden. But clarity doesn't disappear when ignored. It sharpens, and when it's resisted too long, it turns inward. That's where anxiety comes from. That's where overthinking becomes self-attack. That's where intelligence starts eating itself, not because the mind is broken, but because it has nowhere honest to go. The final shift happens when you stop asking how to quiet your mind and start asking how to aim it. A sharp mind without direction becomes destructive. A sharp mind with direction becomes calm. You don't need to escape your thoughts. You need to give them a job worthy of their depth. Once you do, something remarkable happens. Your mind stops circling the same questions, not because the questions vanish, but because they've been metabolized into understanding. You stop replaying the past, not because you've forgotten it, but because you've extracted what it was trying to teach you. You stop fearing the future, not because it's predictable, but because you trust your perception to navigate uncertainty. This is where peace enters, not the shallow kind that comes from distraction, the deep kind that comes from alignment. You begin to live more slowly, but more deliberately. You choose words carefully. You choose commitments selectively. You choose environments that don't constantly fight your nervous system. You stop measuring your life by speed or visibility. You start measuring it by coherence. Does this make sense to who I am? Does this respect my depth? Does this drain me or refine me? These questions quietly shape everything. Your work becomes more focused. Your relationships become fewer but truer. Your solitude becomes restorative instead of heavy. You stop needing to be everywhere. You stop needing to be understood by everyone because you finally understand yourself. And self-understanding changes the way power looks. Power is no longer loud. It no longer needs dominance or validation. Power becomes restraint, discernment, the ability to walk away without explaining. You notice how many people live reactively, chasing approval, status, distraction, noise, and instead of judging them, you feel distance. Not superiority, distance. Because you know what it costs to see clearly. You know the loneliness, the doubt, the temptation to numb or shrink. And you also know what happens when you don't. You become grounded, unshakable in quiet ways. You stop confusing intensity with chaos. You stop confusing silence with weakness. You stop confusing depth with isolation. You realize that the misunderstood mind isn't meant to blend in. It's meant to stand still while the world rushes past, to notice what others miss, to slow meaning down long enough to be understood, to refuse shallow answers even when they're socially rewarded. This doesn't make life easier, it makes it honest. And honesty has a strange effect. It simplifies. You no longer argue with reality. You no longer fight your nature. You no longer apologize for needing depth in a shallow world. You accept that clarity comes with responsibility. Responsibility to choose wisely. Responsibility to protect your attention. Responsibility to avoid turning awareness into arrogance or isolation. Because intelligence without humility hardens, and perception without compassion becomes bitterness. You choose not to let that happen. Instead, you let your mind become what it was always capable of being. Not a battlefield, not a prison, but a lens. A way of seeing that brings calm instead of noise. You were never meant to be normal. You were meant to be aware. And awareness, once accepted, stops feeling like a burden. it becomes a compass, a quiet one, a reliable one that doesn't shout but never lies. And when you finally trust it, the world doesn't feel so confusing anymore. It feels exactly as complex as it is, and for the first time, that feels like peace.